Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about families and delinquency. As a good approach to this, we'll take a biopsychosocial approach just as an introduction. And of course, since we're in a sociology class, we'll definitely be focusing more on the social context. But when you look at things like is or are genetics associated with behavior, they are. There's a lot of studies that demonstrate that. I'm not going to list those. Email me if you want some of that. But again, when we look at things like substance abuse, alcoholism, violence, aggression, a lot of these things are built into our biology. A lot of these things can be built into our genes. And then, depending upon your ancestral DNA and your specific DNA, you can find correlations with specific types of behaviors. So, again, it's a little bit complex. Then, if we're going to take a psychological perspective to looking at things like families and delinquencies, what's going on in your head is influenced by what's going on in the outside world and then your perception of the stimuli in the outside world. And so you can see where, not to point fingers or anything like that, but if we were to label families, like what or how can we label something as dysfunctional? And who am I to judge what is a functional or dysfunctional family? But again, we can look at things like positive and negative outcomes, overall well being, health, socioeconomic status, things along these lines that can pinpoint what might be good or bad. But again, is there a presence of abuse? Is there a presence of neglect? And so when we're looking at the families, then the psychological approach should be, well, how do all these experiences affect the way you're thinking and feeling? And, again, so growing up in a high poverty environment, for example, might influence your attitudes toward criminology or not criminology, but toward committing crimes. In that, if you grow up in a place where, it's more lower class and you have higher rates of crime and that kind of thing is more acceptable, how is that influencing the way you think, for example? Or as we talked about with gender, the experiences of trauma in the home is associated with juvenile delinquency for females. And so, you have to ask, what is going on in someone's head as a result of the family that they're growing up in, and then where is that family located in the social context? Because again, where your family is located within the class system and the culture and the neighborhood you live in is directly correlated with your outcomes. And if we're going to look at things like poverty and then families in poverty and whether that's associated with delinquency, we need to be accounting for all of these factors. And then, of course, from a sociological perspective, we're going to be looking at, the family, where they're located in the social class system, their educational attainment level, the quality of schools the children are going to, their nutrition levels, love, nurturing. I mean, again, it's very complex. So I will never in this lecture be able to consider all of the variables, associated with this, but hopefully as we're going through the class, you're starting to get a good list. What are factors associated with, why someone commits crimes or deviates from social norms, whatever. And so, again, biologically, what is driving us? How is that motivating us? How is that influencing our decision making? Psychologically, how are we thinking? How are we being socialized? What are we experiencing in the social context that's causing us to think and make decisions in certain ways? And then the social context, how are things like economics and the family system and the community associated with whether or not someone commits crimes. And again, it's hard to totally predict who is going to commit crimes, but we can see that there are overlapping variables that are associated with, whether or not someone commits crimes. And we'll get into a few of those in this lecture, as we do in every one. But your book opens up talking about the social context of delinquency, the impact of families on delinquency. And why is the family part of sociology? Because the family itself is an institution of a society that we socially construct for a purpose, which could be to socialize, to teach skills, to take care of things. But then also why we create families is embedded in biology. Like we have oxytocin that rewards us when we create social bonds with our family members. That kind of stuff is passed through the breast milk, it's passed through hugging, it's passed through laughing with each other. We have all these brain rewards, dopamine, and and it's very complex, but that drives us, motivates us to engage in certain things, for example. And so we'll also be looking at the education system, which we'll look at next chapter a lot more when we talk about schools. We're going to be looking at the media and how that influences you, government, politics, the law system, community interventions, whatever it might be. All of these things will be associated with juvenile delinquency. But again, we have to ask initially, is parental behavior related to delinquency? And the book is pretty clear that there is some things that are associated with it. Like, again, are your parents engaging in corporal punishment beyond spanking? I mean, even spanking, but that's a whole different debate, of course. But I mean, again, things that can be labeled as violent, abusive, neglectful types of behavior. You can look at things like permissive parenting styles versus more disciplined parenting styles, and you find that a lax in discipline can be associated with it. But then again, too much discipline can have its own counter effects. And so again, what's the balance? And not that we're going to get into parenting styles today and go deep into that, of course, not the class for that, but it's very interesting. But just think about it for yourself in general. Look around you. What do you see? How do you see parents raising their kids? And then ask yourself, what do you observe? What do you think? And then, of course, we would scientifically support that by going out and finding a way to study parenting styles and then comparing that to whether or not, statistics of juvenile delinquency for that matter. So again, is parenting behavior related to delinquency? Yes, it is. But again, it's hard to always pinpoint like it's your parents' fault. That's why you became a delinquent. It's not to say that. Again, it's a billion variables that are associated with it. There are people that have had the worst parents ever and they became resilient and fought through it and got a job and made it. Okay, then there are other people that are just affected throughout the lifespan. Then there are people that are somewhere in between. It's complex, and how people experience having good or bad parents and however we label what is good or bad, again, is it differs between individuals. So again, it's complex. There's not like one theory or one answer to explain all of it. Okay. But again, there are some counter arguments to this. Like, we can't just point to the parents. The book says things like, people are highly influenced by their peers or group socialization. So maybe it's not your parents' fault, but maybe it's your parents live in like a not a very good neighborhood, and in that neighborhood, people are just slinging crack, and that's the norm, and people aren't really getting good education. So they're not getting the skills to get the jobs. They're not getting the socioeconomic status. Their outlook on life is completely different. You get into that culture of poverty, that culture of criminality and drugs, whatever it might be. Again, what are the inroads to becoming a juvenile delinquent or just a criminal in general, or however you want to label somebody? You can see that there are these general social forces, like, how rich is the town you grew up in? What was it like? Was it nice? Was it happy? Did they have good things? What are the schools like? Did they challenge you? Were you ready for college when you got there? Could you just knock out a paper like it was nothing? Okay. And then again, your book points at things like the relationship between parental socialization and childhood outcomes is largely due to genes that are shared between parent and offspring. So again, which is it? Is it genetics? Is it the social context where we're out in the economy and the type of neighborhood we live in and the type of friends that we're hanging out with? Or is it our parents and the way they raised us? It's all the above. There, all these variables can be accounting for it. Just maybe pieces of different things at different times for each person. But again, that's the beauty of sociology. It's like you have a social phenomena going on, like juvenile delinquency. Okay, why is that happening? And to answer that question is just ridiculously complex. You have to think about a bazillion variables. So again, I hope I'm pushing that into your idea. There's not just one answer. We need to be thinking about things like race, sex, gender, economics, family, the psychological factors. What's going on? Is your brain like, does it function in the same way that everybody else's does? I mean, think about things like sociopathic behavior and violent behavior and lack of empathy. I mean, so much of that is biological in nature. It's complex. But again, family factors like having a broken home. This tends to affect males and, I'm sorry, females and blacks more than it does males and non-blacks, for example. Birth order, the middle child is more likely. Family size in larger families. Now we have to ask why. Why broken homes does it affect females? I have that written wrong there. But why does it affect females more than it affect males? Why is their inroad to juvenile delinquency often trauma and trouble at home or, a dysfunctional family, whereas males is more culture and peer influence? Again, it's complex. And why African Americans? Is that because black mothers are more likely to be single parents? Black people are more likely to be subjugated into the lower classes due to racism? It's complex. Why middle child? Your book says that the first child gets all the attention, the third child learns from the other childs, and the middle one is just kind of stuck in between. That's literally what it says. It's a little like, okay. And then why family size is because you have more time if you have only one or two children to spend with them than you do when you have a bunch of kids running around. It's a bunch of chaos. Then your book also says things like your siblings and parents being criminals is also associated with you getting exposed to that way of life. Then it points at things like quality of home life, marital adjustment, and harmony more than whether it's intact. So again, it's not so much, the presence of two parents or any of these things. Really, it's about the quality of the home. Okay, family rejection is a huge one. This often results in things like homelessness, especially for like LGBTQ youth. And then that leads to a life of criminality, getting caught up in the system, drugs, things along those lines. Your book pointed at discipline in the home, saying those with less supervision are more likely to be juvenile delinquents than those with higher levels of supervision. Again, kind of looking at control theory. Do we need social control? And then it also pointed to things like community efficacy reduces delinquency. Therefore, if you're growing up in this nice neighborhood where everyone's holding everybody accountable, you tend to see a reduction in juvenile delinquency. But again, these are just a couple of these variables. Just start thinking about things. Here we have transitions in delinquency was the next heading that your book starts talking about. And again, it starts looking at family types, poverty, economics, and again, it gets really complex. Because once you start delving into families by family type and then the association with family type and juvenile delinquency, you can look at things like what about parents who have never divorced that are married with high socioeconomic status? Are their children less likely to be juvenile delinquents than single parents growing up in low income families where they're borderline homeless? And again, you start to see these disparities. So the book says divorced and single parent families, poverty, homelessness, alcohol and drug abuse, and violence are just some more family problems that affect adolescents today that can increase the likelihood of having, maybe a rough upcoming upbringing that can lead to things like juvenile delinquency or just not having things, lacking things like strain theory. They just don't have what they need, or lacking educational attainment, and they're lacking hope because they don't see an outcome or a good future for their life. Your book also looks at racial and ethnic disparities. As many as 40% of Caucasian children and 75% of African American children experience divorce or separation in their family before they reach 16. Many of these children experience multiple family disruptions over the course of their adulthood. So, how does things like family disruptions, cohabitating, blended families, again, these are factors that are associated with juvenile delinquency. Also, looking at things like poverty. Poverty is a problem for children in general. 17.5% of children ages 0 to 17 are in poverty. And so, again, how is poverty associated with delinquency? Those growing up in poor neighborhoods are exposed to a culture of poverty. Within that culture of poverty, you tend to see increases in crime rates, less educational attainment, less job prestige, less socioeconomic status, more substance abuse, more alcohol abuse, more violence. And the more violence thing is a little bit debated, especially when it comes to domestic violence, because those with money, of course, can cover things up a little bit easier. But again, your book says economic hardship and a lack of access to opportunity, again, being stuck in the lower classes, tends to undermine marital and parental functioning. Furthermore, adolescents who experience family transitions may have difficulty managing anger and other negative emotions that may contribute to their involvement with delinquency and drugs. And so, again, when you look at the effects, the psychological effects of divorce and how that affects kids' adjustment and whether that affects kids' quality of educational attainment, how well they're doing, I guess, educational achievement, it does affect it. Okay. And so, again, and then when we look at education, you're going to see that less educational attainment then can lead to things like juvenile delinquency. Homelessness, regardless of a child's age, is likely to expose him or her to settings permeated by substance abuse, promiscuity, pornography, prostitution, and crime. Unemployment has a huge effect on families. You had 4.9% of families that are experiencing unemployment rate. And again, how many families are living out of their cars right now? How many families are struggling to pay the rent in the US? And then, this just gets complicated. Neglect, abuse, economic hardships are common factors in family settings where alcohol misuse and substance abuse are ordinary behavior. And again, does the like in so and it's confounding. So like drug use increases with lower class status, but alcohol use increases with upper class status, and so you might see some disparities here. Marital violence is also a pervasive problem that affects nearly 1/3 of the married population. Numerous studies show that some parents act out their aggression on their children, and some families use physical violence for disciplinary purposes. And then you also have to look at the effects of foster families, and the books gets into the statistics of how often these kids are bounced around. Some of the associations with adoption, and adoption is a little bit of a toss-up. That one again depends on the time, the age that the kid was adopted, things along those lines. So again, as hopefully you're seeing that there are just all kinds of factors here. But for this chapter, we're kind of grounding ourselves in the family, and then growing up in that family. And then growing up in that family, what are you likely to be exposed to? Okay, so again, with your parents, what's that relationship like? Positive, good, abusive, bad? Relationships with siblings. Are people doing drugs? Are they introducing you to negative things? And then looking at the broader social forces of where that family is located. How is the socioeconomic status of the family? What's their neighborhood like? What are they exposed to out in the outside world? Then looking at the schools, what's the quality of the educational attainment that's around? Can they get a good degree? Do they have access to go to college? Do they have the money to go to trade school to get at least some skills, whatever it might be? We need to be thinking about all these factors throughout the class to explain, why this happens. But again, a big portion of this chapter when you're talking about families is the, detrimental effects of neglect and child abuse. You're seeing some pretty high rates. People that have been abused or neglected, it increases their arrest rate by 59%, and violent crime rate by 30%. Maltreated children were younger at the time of their first arrest, committed nearly twice as many offenses, and were arrested more frequently. Physically abused and neglected children were the most likely to be arrested for a violent crime. Again, why are they committing violent crimes? Because they're learning the behaviors. Again, if you hit a kid, what is that teaching that kid? Again, if you look at positive reinforcement versus punishment, positive reinforcement teaches behaviors, and even negative reinforcement teaches behaviors. But punishment just stops behaviors without teaching them. So again, they're learning the negative behaviors, which is increasing their likelihood to be that way themselves. Caucasian abused and neglected children, however, were no more likely to be arrested for a violent crime than their non-abused and non-neglected Caucasian counterparts. However, when race was accounted for, African American abused and neglected children showed significantly increased of violent arrests compared with African American children who were not maltreated. And then younger children make up the largest percentage of victims of neglect and child abuse. If you look over at my chart on the right, it's absolutely heartbreaking. But again, babies are, 2.5 times more likely to be abused than any other age. It does decrease with time. But again, what are the effects with being abused and neglected at these young ages? Okay, it's absolutely detrimental. Statistics show that 91% of child maltreatment victims are abused by their parents, with another 4.7% abused by other relatives. Women are more likely to be the perpetrators than men, not because they're more violent, but because, of course, they spend more time with the kids. Okay? And nearly 85% of perpetrators of neglect and child abuse are below 45 years of age. And your book does get into the types of abuse: physical abuse, sexual, emotional, physical neglect, and then emotional neglect. Very heartbreaking, the things that kids experience. Child abuse and delinquency appear to be closely correlated. And again, why might abuse lead to delinquency? And I mean, your book gets into it. There are consequences of abuse and neglect. Again, what happens to the psychology of them? I mean, imagine having experienced that. Why, does it increase their likelihood to run away, which increases their likelihood to be homeless? It increases their likelihood to be prostitutes and engage in substance abuse. Research supports that neglected and abused children have greater difficulty in school. Why? Same thing with like divorce. Why? Again, some of these things can just be traumatic. And then it's hard for us to function. And then we start to struggle in these environments where we're expected to behave in certain ways. It can be tough. Evidence suggests that sexual abuse victims themselves may become involved or deviant sexual behavior later, again, because it's learned. And children who have experienced abusive and violent childhoods are likely to grow up and express violent behavior, again, because it's learned. Child abuse in the juvenile justice system. So, as a result, as we've discussed, the state intervenes in certain occasions, whether it be to intervene to put somebody in jail and lock them up, or whether it is to intervene and take a child out of a home, or even to remove parental rights altogether. So, we have an entire bureaucracy set up to deal with that in the juvenile justice system with child protective services. This usually refers to services that are provided by an agency authorized to act on behalf of a child when parents are unwilling or unable to do so. They get this right from the state. In all states, these agencies are required by law to conduct assessments or investigations of reports of child abuse and neglect, to offer treatment services to families where maltreatment has taken place or is likely to occur. They identify, report, intake, investigate, and assess, along with engaging in case planning, evaluation of family progress, and case closure when it comes to dealing with cases where the state is expected to intervene. The involvement of juvenile or family court, termination of parental rights, and prosecution of parents can often be a final solution. But again, what is causing the state to have to intervene? And that's the bigger question that we have to be asking. And that's because this kind of stuff exists. So, again, to assume that everybody's growing up in this incredibly happy house, that's a misnomer. You know, 1 out of 3 women experience some kind of violence. I think it's 1 out of 5 boys experience some form of physical violence. And then again, thinking about all the other factors like where the kids are growing up, the region, the culture that they're exposed to, what's going on in their head, what's going on in their body that's driving them to engage in certain behaviors. Again, it's incredibly complex. So when we're going to try to figure out delinquency across the life course, we're looking at family related risk factors for delinquency. You know, again, how much of somebody committing crimes across the life course is because of the way your parents raised you? And again, that's a larger question. At one point are you an adult? But again, how much of like our experiences when we were young influence our decisions when we're old? So again, some of these risk factors and linked outcomes are ineffective parenting and low self-control. Again, our ability to parent, to structure children, to socialize them, to teach them skills, to teach them the social norms, and hopefully ask them to conform to them when the norms should be conformed to is something that we should be considering. And then again, these psychological factors like low self-control. We need to be looking at links between corporal punishment, violence from parents, and delinquent behaviors, family structure at the time of adolescence, things like single-parent families, divorced parents, blended families, all of these things can be factors. Did they experience physical abuse early in their life cycle? Again, that's when it's most likely. Links between being married and reduction in delinquency. Again, you can look at differential factors between socioeconomic status of married and unmarried parents and how that's associated with it. And that's just tons of factors there. Child maltreatment can be an influential factor leading to such undesirable outcomes as emotional trauma, running away, disruptive and truant behavior in school, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual behavior, and violence and abuse. The more serious the maltreatment of a child, the more likely it is that he or she will become involved in these behaviors, which can have extremely negative consequences for his or her life course. The abused child, if seriously abused, can even become involved in taking a parent's life, just to end it on a dark note. Okay? So, in conclusion, the quality of life within the home is a more significant deterrent of delinquent behavior than the presence of both parents. Parental rejection is associated with delinquent behavior. Inconsistent, lax, or severe discipline is associated with increased delinquency. Delinquent behavior among children increases proportionally with the number of problems within the family. divorced and single parent families, blended families, births to unmarried women, alcohol and drug abuse, poverty and violence are problems that families encounter and can be associated with juvenile delinquency. The failure of a family to provide for the needs of its children can have an effect on the attitudes and behaviors of those children that can last into their adult years and even for the rest of their lives. Children who have been neglected and abused may experience psychological problems, run away from home, become involved in truancy and disruptive behavior in school, and turn to drug and alcohol abuse. Some neglected and abused youngsters become involved in deviant sexual behavior and assume an aggressive stance toward others. Moreover, research findings show at least a partial link between child abuse and neglect and delinquent behavior and status offenses. So, again, it's a little bit sad thinking about some of the things that people might experience in life that leads them down a life of crime or just juvenile delinquency in general. But again, we have to be thinking about all of these institutions like the family, the economy, the government, laws, the region, culture, psychological factors, biological factors when thinking about this. Again, it's incredibly complex. So hopefully I'm just with this lecture really just drilling in that there are a bazillion variables. And you can't just look and say it's just the parents' fault or it's just the economics of the city, or everyone's just in poverty, or that person's just completely crazy and out of their mind, or their body is just driving them to engage in violent behavior toward other people. It's a blend of all of these things. It's that biopsychosocial approach. And again, it's complex. So hopefully, as a good summary to wrap that up, juvenile delinquency is complex. There are so many variables we have to think about, but that's what sociology is for. Examining and controlling for all these variables and then trying to either predict behavior or at least account for behavior and why it is occurring. Again, thank you all so much and have a wonderful day.